Dad gave his business to my younger brother at his retirement party instead of me because I was a disappointment in his eyes. Hey Reddit, I'm Mark, 35, and I've been dealing with the fallout of my father's decision to pass the family business to my younger brother instead of me. My dad's retirement party was supposed to be a celebration, but it turned into one of the most humiliating nights of my life. I've spent years trying to prove myself to my father, only to be overlooked and dismissed as a disappointment. Here's the story of how I learned to move on and reclaim my life after my dad's betrayal. Growing up, the family business was everything. My dad, Robert, now 65, started a small construction company when he was in his late 20s. He built it from the ground up, taking on any job that came his way: roofing, renovations, even the odd handyman task, until it became one of the most respected construction companies in our town. By the time I was old enough to understand what he did, the company was thriving, and everyone in town knew my dad as Bob the Builder, a nickname he wore with pride. My earliest memories are of hanging around the shop, watching my dad and his crew work. I'd be there on Saturdays, sweeping the floors, sorting tools, and feeling like I was part of something big. My dad was my hero back then. He'd tell me stories about how he started with nothing, how he'd worked day and night to build a better life for his family. He'd often say, "Mark, hard work is everything. You've got to earn your place in this world. Nobody's going to hand it to you." From a young age, I wanted nothing more than to follow in his footsteps. I'd shadow him at job sites, learning everything I could about construction, how to measure, cut, and build. My dad was tough, never one to dish out praise easily, but I lived for those rare moments when he'd pat me on the back and say, "Good job, kid." It felt like I was earning my place, slowly but surely. My dad was a larger-than-life figure in our town. He was respected by everyone, not just for his work but for his dedication and grit. He'd built his business on the foundation of integrity and hard work, and he never shied away from reminding us how much he'd sacrificed. I remember him coming home late, covered in dust and sweat, barely having time to eat dinner before passing out on the couch. Those were the nights when he'd teach me the value of hard work, telling me how he once worked 3 days straight on a job because a client's house had flooded, and he wouldn't rest until it was fixed. "People rely on us, Mark," he'd say, his voice thick with exhaustion but full of pride. "This business isn't just about money, it's about making sure people feel safe in their homes. Never forget that." Then there was my younger brother, Jason, now 30. Jason and I were close growing up, but we couldn't have been more different. Where I was obsessed with learning the ins and outs of the business, Jason was the carefree, fun-loving kid who spent his weekends playing sports and hanging out with friends. He was the star athlete in high school, excelling in football and track, while I was the quiet, nerdy kid who spent his free time studying blueprints and construction manuals. Jason was always charming and effortlessly popular, with a natural charisma that drew people to him. He'd flash his easy smile, and everyone, teachers, coaches, friends, seemed to bend over backward for him. My dad adored Jason's outgoing nature, often saying that Jason could sell ice to an Eskimo with his charm. He was the golden child in every sense of the word: athletic, smart, and always the center of attention. My mom, Karen, now 62, was always the peacemaker in our family. She was the glue that held us all together, constantly smoothing over conflicts and making sure everyone felt loved. She supported my dad's dreams but also made sure Jason and I had our own interests. While my dad was all about work, my mom was the one who encouraged us to find our own passions. She'd bake cookies for Jason's football games, cheer him on from the stands, and then come home to help me with my school projects, always trying to balance her attention between us. Despite our differences, Jason and I got along well enough. We'd play catch in the backyard, go fishing on the weekends, and generally stayed out of each other's way. But it was clear that Jason was my dad's favorite. Where I had to earn every bit of praise, Jason got it effortlessly. He was the golden child, charming, athletic, and always the life of the party. My dad would take him to football games, proudly cheering him on from the stands, while I'd be back at the shop, working on whatever project my dad had left for me that day. I tried not to let it bother me, but it was hard. I craved my dad's approval, and no matter how hard I worked, it felt like I could never measure up to Jason. My dad would say things like, "Jason's got that spark, Mark." He's a natural leader. I'd nod, hiding my frustration, wondering why my hard work never seemed to be enough. I spent my teenage years with my head down, working tirelessly to prove myself in the only way I knew how, by showing up, day after day, and doing whatever it took to keep the business running smoothly. As I got older, I started taking on more responsibility at the shop. My dad would let me help with estimates, manage smaller projects, and even run the crew when he was too busy. I was learning the business inside and out, and I was damn good at it. But no matter how much I did, my dad's praise always felt conditional, as if he was waiting for me to make a mistake. Meanwhile, Jason was off living his best life. He was the quarterback of the high school football team, dating the head cheerleader, and cruising through life with a smile on his face. My dad would proudly tell anyone who would listen about Jason's latest achievements, while my hard work often went unnoticed. I'd try to join the conversations, sharing updates about a project I'd just completed or a new client I'd brought in, but my dad's eyes would always glaze over, his attention drifting back to Jason. It hurt, but I kept pushing forward. I'd tell myself that if I just worked a little harder, did a little more, my dad would finally see me the way he saw Jason. I lived for those rare moments when he'd give me a nod of approval or a brief good job. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me going. After high school, I went straight to work for my dad's company. College wasn't really on the table for me. My grades were decent, but my heart was in the business, and I was eager to prove myself. I started at the bottom, working alongside the crew, learning the ropes from the ground up. I put in long hours, doing everything from heavy lifting to managing inventory, and slowly worked my way up to a foreman position. While I was grinding away at the family business, Jason went off to college on a sports scholarship. He majored in business, which my dad thought was perfect. Jason could bring his newfound knowledge back to the company, making it even more successful. My dad was thrilled, constantly bragging about Jason's accomplishments to anyone who would listen. Meanwhile, I was back home, working my ass off, hoping that someday my dedication would pay off. Jason's return from college was a turning point. He came back with a degree, a flashy car, and an air of confidence that I couldn't quite match. My dad immediately started involving him in the business, handing him responsibilities that I'd spent years working towards. Jason was put in charge of marketing, handling client relations, and eventually overseeing some of the bigger projects. I was happy for him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being sidelined. I remember one particular afternoon when I was working on site, sweating under the sun as I directed the crew. Jason pulled up in his brand new car, dressed in a crisp suit and carrying a briefcase. He looked every bit the young executive, and my dad couldn't have been prouder. They went off to a meeting with a potential new client, leaving me behind to handle the grunt work. I watched them go, feeling a knot tighten in my chest. I'd been busting my ass in the heat, and yet my dad seemed to place more value on Jason's polished presentations than on the hard labor that kept the company running. Dad started treating Jason like his right-hand man, consulting him on decisions and praising his ideas. Jason was always full of fresh, bold suggestions, some good, some not so much, but my dad loved his enthusiasm. Meanwhile, I was still the guy who did the grunt work, managing the crew and keeping things running smoothly behind the scenes. It was like everything I'd done up to that point was suddenly invisible. It wasn't just at work. My dad's favoritism spilled over into our personal lives as well. Family dinners became unbearable as my dad and Jason would talk shop, discussing new business strategies and expansion ideas while I sat there, feeling like an outsider in my own family. I tried to chime in with my thoughts, but my dad would quickly dismiss me, brushing off my suggestions as if they were insignificant. "Mark, you don't understand how the business side works," he'd say, cutting me off mid-sentence. "Leave that to Jason." It stung every time. I'd been in the trenches for years, learning every aspect of the business, but my dad still saw me as nothing more than a laborer. No matter how hard I worked, it was never enough to earn his respect. One night, after a particularly grueling week, I mustered up the courage to talk to my dad. I was nervous, but I needed to know where I stood. "Dad, I've been working here for over 10 years, I began, trying to keep my voice steady. I love this business, and I want to be a bigger part of it. I feel like I've proven myself, but I'm not sure if you see that." My dad looked at me, his expression unreadable. He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Mark, you're a hard worker. No one's denying that. But sometimes, it's not just about putting in the hours. It's about having that spark, that drive to push things forward. Jason's got that. He's got the vision." I felt my stomach drop. It was the same old story. No matter what I did, I'd never be the son with the spark. I'd never be Jason. I wanted to argue, to tell him that I had my own ideas, my own vision, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. To my dad, I'd always be the dependable workhorse, not the leader he was looking for. When my dad announced his retirement, it wasn't a complete surprise. He'd been hinting at it for months, talking about how he wanted to spend more time fishing, traveling with my mom, and enjoying the fruits of his labor. He'd built the company from nothing, and now it was time for him to step back and let the next generation take over. The announcement came at a family dinner, with just the four of us gathered around the table. My mom was beaming, clearly thrilled at the prospect of spending more time with my dad after all these years. Jason looked excited, already buzzing with ideas about the future. And me? I was anxious, but hopeful. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the chance to finally prove myself, to show my dad that I was ready to take the reins. "I've been thinking a lot about the future of the company," my dad began, his voice calm and measured. "And I've made some decisions. I'm stepping down as CEO, effective next month." I felt my heart racing. This was it. This was my moment. "Jason," my dad continued, turning to my brother with a proud smile, "I want you to take over as CEO." My world shattered. I stared at my dad, unable to process what I just heard. Jason? He was giving the company to Jason? I glanced at my brother, who looked just as stunned as I was, but his shock quickly turned into a wide grin. "Dad, are you serious?" Jason asked, trying to contain his excitement. My dad nodded. "You've got the drive, the ideas, and the business background. You're exactly what this company needs to keep moving forward." I couldn't believe it. All those years I'd spent working my ass off, all those weekends I'd given up, all the sacrifices I'd made, and for what? To watch my younger brother waltz in and take the position I'd spent my entire life working towards? What about me? I blurted out, unable to keep my frustration in check. "I've been here since day one. I've put in the hours, I've done the work. Don't I deserve a chance?" My dad's face hardened. He looked at me with that same disappointed expression I'd seen 1,000 times before. "Mark, you've always been a hard worker, and I appreciate that. But it's not just about hard work. Jason's got the vision, the leadership skills. He's the right fit for this role." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. It wasn't just about losing the job, it was about losing my dad's respect. In his eyes, I was still the same kid who could never measure up, who was never quite good enough. I'd spent my entire life trying to prove myself to him, and in this one moment, all of that effort felt completely meaningless. The rest of dinner was a blur. My mom tried to lighten the mood, talking about their plans for a cruise and a long-awaited trip to Italy, but I couldn't focus. I was too busy replaying my dad's words over and over in my head, each one cutting deeper than the last. Jason kept glancing at me, his expression a mix of sympathy and excitement, but I couldn't bring myself to look at him. I felt like I was suffocating, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My dad's retirement party was held at a fancy banquet hall downtown, filled with friends, family, and business associates who had watched him build the company from the ground up. It was supposed to be a celebration of his legacy, but for me, it felt like a funeral, like I was burying the dreams I'd held onto for so long. I showed up in my best suit, trying to put on a brave face, but inside I was seething. I'd barely spoken to my dad since the announcement, and every time I saw Jason, all I could see was the opportunity I'd been denied. I felt like a stranger in my own family, watching from the sidelines as my dad and brother basked in the spotlight. The evening started off with speeches from my dad's old friends and colleagues, each one praising his hard work, his dedication, and the company he'd built. I stood at the back of the room, clapping politely, but all I could think about was how I'd never get to stand up there, never get to be the one carrying on the legacy I'd worked so hard to be a part of. Then came the big moment. My dad took the stage, beaming as the crowd applauded. He thanked everyone for being there, reminisced about the early days of the company, and shared stories about the highs and lows of his career. He talked about the sacrifices he'd made, the long hours, the tough decisions, and the pride he felt in what he'd built. And now, he said, turning to Jason with a smile, it's time for the next chapter. I'm passing the torch to my son, Jason, who I know will take this company to new heights. The room erupted in applause. Jason stood up, looking every bit the golden boy, and made his way to the stage. I watched, my chest tightening with every step he took. This was supposed to be my moment, but instead, I was watching it play out like some twisted nightmare. Jason took the microphone, his voice full of gratitude. Thank you, Dad. I'm honored to be taking over the company. I've got big plans, and I can't wait to get started. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and walked out of the room, ignoring the confused looks from my family. I needed air, needed space, needed to get away from the crushing weight of disappointment that was suffocating me. I ended up outside, leaning against the wall, fighting back tears of frustration and anger. I'd never felt so small, so insignificant. My entire life had been dedicated to earning my place in the family business, and in one fell swoop, my dad had taken that away from me. He'd made it clear that I was a disappointment, that no matter how hard I worked, I'd never be enough. I spent the rest of the night driving aimlessly, my mind racing with thoughts of everything I'd lost. I thought about all the sacrifices I'd made, the years of hard work, the countless nights spent at the shop while my friends were out enjoying their youth. I thought about the times my dad had promised that hard work would pay off, that if I just kept pushing, I'd earn my place. But those promises had been empty, and now I was left with nothing but regret. After the retirement party, I couldn't bring myself to go back to work at the company. Every time I thought about stepping into that office, all I could see was my dad's face, telling me that I wasn't good enough. I felt like a stranger in my own life, lost and directionless. I spent the next few weeks avoiding my family. My mom called constantly, trying to check on me, but I ignored her messages. I knew she meant well, but I couldn't bear to hear her try to smooth things over, to make excuses for my dad's decision. I wasn't ready to forgive, and I wasn't ready to pretend that everything was okay. Jason tried to reach out too. He left voicemails, texts, even showed up at my apartment once, but I couldn't face him. It wasn't his fault, but every time I looked at him, all I saw was the person my dad had chosen over me. It hurt too much to be around him, to see how easily he'd stepped into the role I'd spent my whole life preparing for. I drifted from job to job, picking up odd construction gigs and freelance work, but nothing felt right. I was angry, bitter, and drowning in self-pity. I'd lost my sense of purpose, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd failed, not just myself, but my family. I spent my days in a haze of resentment, replaying the events of the retirement party over and over in my mind. I couldn't understand why my dad hadn't seen my potential, why he'd never given me the chance I'd earned. It felt like a betrayal, like he'd written me off as a failure before I'd even had a chance to prove myself. One night, after a few too many beers, I broke down. I smashed a photo of my dad and me at one of the job sites from when I was a kid, the one where he'd first taught me how to use a hammer. I stared at the broken glass, my reflection distorted and blurred, and I realized that I'd been holding onto a version of my dad that no longer existed. The hero I'd idolized as a kid was gone, replaced by a man who saw me as nothing more than a disappointment. I spent weeks in this dark place, isolating myself from everyone and everything. I barely left my apartment, and when I did, it was only to pick up another case of beer or a pack of cigarettes. I'd sit on my balcony, staring at the city below, feeling like I was watching my life slip away. The anger I felt toward my dad was consuming me, and I didn't know how to move past it. One day, my mom showed up unannounced. She let herself in with the spare key I'd given her years ago, and I could see the shock on her face when she walked in. The place was a mess: empty beer cans, takeout containers, and dirty clothes strewn everywhere. I hadn't cared enough to clean up, and now I felt ashamed. "Mark, this isn't you," she said, her voice trembling. "You can't keep living like this." I didn't respond. I couldn't look her in the eye. I knew she was right, but I didn't have the energy to pull myself out of the hole I'd fallen into. My mom sat down next to me, her eyes filled with tears. "I know you're hurt, and I know you feel like your dad let you down. But you can't let this destroy you. You've got so much potential, Mark. You're smart, talented, and you've got a heart bigger than anyone I know. Don't let this be the end." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd spent so long feeling sorry for myself that I'd lost sight of who I was. My mom's belief in me, even when I couldn't believe in myself, was the wake-up call I needed. I knew I couldn't keep wallowing in self-pity. I had to pick myself up and find a way forward. It took me months to pull myself out of the pit I'd fallen into. I hit rock bottom before I finally realized that I couldn't keep living like this, couldn't keep letting my dad's opinion define me. I needed to find my own path, one that wasn't tied to the family business or my father's expectations. I started taking on more freelance projects, working for small clients who appreciated my skills. I poured myself into my work, finding solace in the physical labor and the satisfaction of building something from nothing. I was good at what I did, and for the first time in a long time, I started to feel like maybe I wasn't the failure my dad had made me out to be. I eventually landed a job with a boutique construction firm that specialized in custom homes. It wasn't the family business, but it was mine, and I was proud of it. I worked my way up quickly, earning the respect of my colleagues and clients. I was finally doing work that I loved, on my terms, and it felt damn good. As the months passed, I started to rebuild my confidence. I realized that I didn't need my dad's approval to be successful, and I didn't need the family business to validate my worth. I was carving out my own space in the world, and it was a space that I'd earned through my own hard work and determination. I took on projects that challenged me, pushing myself to learn new skills and expand my capabilities. I started networking with other professionals in the industry, building connections that opened doors I never thought possible. I was no longer just the son of Bob the Builder, I was Mark, a skilled and respected contractor in my own right. One of my proudest moments came when I completed a renovation for a historic home in the heart of the city. It was a complex job, requiring meticulous attention to detail and a deep understanding of traditional craftsmanship. I poured my heart into the project, spending countless hours restoring the home to its former glory. When it was finished, the owner couldn't stop raving about my work, and I felt a sense of pride that I hadn't felt in years. I realized then that I didn't need my dad's business to prove my worth. I was capable of standing on my own, of building something that was entirely mine. And for the first time, I felt free from the weight of my dad's expectations. It wasn't easy, but I eventually reconnected with my family. My mom was the first to reach out, inviting me to dinner after months of radio silence. I was hesitant, still nursing the wounds of my dad's betrayal, but I missed my family, and I knew I couldn't keep avoiding them forever. Dinner was awkward at first. My dad was quieter than usual, his usual bravado replaced with a palpable tension. My mom tried to fill the silence with small talk, but it was clear that the elephant in the room wasn't going away. Halfway through the meal, my dad finally spoke up. "Mark, I know you're upset. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I want you to know that it was never my intention to hurt you." I put down my fork, looking him in the eye. "Dad, you made your choice. I just wish you'd seen what I was capable of." He nodded, his face creased with regret. "I see it now, Mark. I should have given you more credit. You've always been the hardest worker, and I'm proud of what you've done, even if I didn't show it." It wasn't the apology I'd been hoping for, but it was a start. We had a long way to go, but hearing my dad acknowledge my efforts was a small step toward healing. I didn't need him to tell me I was enough, I'd already proven that to myself, but it felt good to finally hear those words. Jason and I also started to rebuild our relationship. He'd taken to the role of CEO like a natural, but he'd also been struggling with the pressure of living up to our dad's expectations. We found common ground in our shared frustrations, and over time, we were able to move past the bitterness that had driven us apart. Jason confided in me about the challenges he was facing, the constant pressure to be perfect and to live up to our dad's legacy. He admitted that he often felt overwhelmed, and that he missed the days when things were simpler, when we were just two brothers playing catch in the backyard. "I never wanted to come between you and Dad," Jason said one evening, his voice heavy with guilt. "I just wanted to do right by him. But I always knew how much this business meant to you, and I'm sorry if I made you feel like you didn't belong." I appreciated Jason's honesty. It wasn't his fault that our dad had made the choices he did, and it wasn't fair for me to hold that against him. We were both just trying to find our way, caught in the crossfire of our dad's expectations. Reclaiming my life wasn't easy, but it was worth it. I'd spent years chasing my dad's approval, only to realize that the only approval I needed was my own. I'd built a new life, one that was mine alone, and I was proud of the man I'd become. My relationship with my dad was still a work in progress, but we were finding our way back to each other, slowly but surely. He started to come around, asking about my projects and even showing up to some of my job sites. It wasn't the father-son partnership I'd always dreamed of, but it was enough. I'd learned that my worth wasn't tied to my dad's business, and it wasn't defined by anyone's expectations but my own. I was capable, resilient, and determined, and I'd finally found the courage to stand on my own 2 feet. I started mentoring younger guys who were just getting into the construction business, passing on the lessons I'd learned the hard way. I taught them about more than just construction. I taught them about resilience, about standing up for themselves, and about the importance of believing in their own abilities, even when others didn't. It felt good to give back, to take my experiences and use them to help others find their way. One day, I received a call from a client who'd been referred to me by someone at my dad's company. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should take the job, but then I remembered all the work I'd put in to get where I was. I took the call, did the job, and received glowing feedback. It was a small but powerful reminder that I was on the right path. My dad and I continued to rebuild our relationship, bit by bit. We'd have lunch every now and then, talking about life, work, and the challenges of running a business. He never outright apologized for his decision, but I could see in his eyes that he understood the impact it had on me. He'd ask about my latest projects, genuinely interested in what I was doing, and for the first time, I felt like he was seeing me for who I was, not who he wanted me to be. Reddit update, the aftermath. Opie, Dad gave his business to my younger brother at his retirement party instead of me because I was a disappointment in his eyes. Hey everyone, I wanted to give an update and thank you all for your support. It's been a rough journey, but I've finally found my footing. My dad's decision to pass the business to my younger brother was one of the most painful experiences of my life, but it also forced me to find my own path. I've built a career that I'm proud of, and I've learned that my worth isn't defined by anyone else's opinion, not even my dad's. My relationship with my family is still healing, but we're taking it one step at a time. To anyone dealing with family expectations, just know that it's okay to forge your own path. You don't have to live up to anyone else's standards. You are enough, and you have the power to define your own success. Thanks for being part of my journey. Here's to new beginnings, to finding strength in ourselves, and to living life on our own terms.